Ah, the 70s. What a great time to be alive. Saturday Night Fever is taking over the club scene, disco is a huge craze, and President Nixon wages the war on drugs, stating that drugs are public enemy number one.
Making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
And in the streets of New York, a new magazine would take to the shelves. Considered the greatest counterculture publication of all time, at its peak it reached 4 million readers a month, grossed over $5 million a year, an acclaimed publishing success story of the 70s. Today, we're talking about the rise of High Times magazine. But before we get into that, let's pay some bills and give a huge shout out to today's sponsors. Spider Farmer has got some of the best lights in the game, budget friendly, economical, easy to put together. If you head on over to spiderfarmer.ca, check out their listings. They've got an incredible selection of lights, tents, fans, you name it. You can get your hands on that. If you use promo code PIGEONS5, you can save a few dollars off at checkout. And don't forget to thank them for being a sponsor of today's video. And of course, a huge shout out to AC Infinity. AC Infinity's got the best name in the game when it comes to all products in your garden. Whether it's a humidifier, whether it's the clip-on fans, the inlines, the tents, they've got you covered. If you head over to www.acinfinity.com, use promo code PIGEONS420, you're going to be able to save a few dollars off and checkout, help support the show, and of course, get your hands on some of the best products in the game. Now, in order to dive into the High Times magazine, it's very important that we start to understand this guy, Tom Forcade. He is the creator of High Times magazine. He graduated from the Utah University with a degree in business administration. He would go on to join the Air Force, but would ultimately be discharged because he would convince the Air Guard that he was totally and legally insane. He managed to use his skills that he learned from the Air Force and actually trafficked drugs from Mexico to Colombia and used the proceeds to form a hippie commune and the underground magazine called Orpheus. Now, Orpheus essentially was the predecessor to High Times magazine. After this, with a lot of pressure from law enforcement, paranoia stirring, he decided to move to New York, where he would become famous for starting the very first High Times magazine in 1974. To launch the new publication, Forcade would rent a ballroom at the National Boutique in 1973. This featured over 100 drug paraphernalia companies. A promotional flyer with a long list of article ideas was published. "We were the hit of the boutique show," recalls Ed Dwyer, High Times' first editor-in-chief, because at the time, it was filled with a lot of paraphernalia companies. It should have been called the National Paraphernalia Show. Joints were dispensed, gas was dispensed, the line outside was incredible. After considering titles like Tilt and National Weed, they decided the magazine would be called High Times. The first cover featured a woman eating a mushroom, a non-psychedelic variety that they had bought at a supermarket. "We wanted it to come off as an unthreatening, upbeat presentation of an act of getting high," Ed Dwyer remembers. A modest print run of 10,000 copies sold out immediately. Since High Times at the time was issued quarterly, there was a long 3-month wait in between issues. In the meantime, they printed another 10,000 issues, which ultimately sold out immediately, then another 15,000. They upped the print run for the second issue to 25,000 issues. When that sold out, they printed another 25,000 issues. For the third issue, they printed 50,000 copies. The fourth, 100,000 copies, then 150,000 for the fifth. By now, High Times was a national phenomenon. High Times went far beyond its mandate to just report on drugs. We were a viable news operation. We had over 200 radio stations linked to us, and we were feeding daily reports into radio stations. High Times would play an important role in unveiling the dangers to soldiers in Vietnam by the exposure of Agent Orange. No one had heard of Agent Orange, but once its use as a defoliant in Vietnam was exposed in High Times, Vietnam veterans initiated ultimately successful suits against the government. For those that don't know, the United States government was spraying cannabis fields in Mexico with a product called paraquat, and it mixed with another herbicide called 2,4-D, which together created Agent Orange.
Agent Orange was just one of a series of heavy-duty chemicals the U.S. military used in Southeast Asia, called rainbow herbicides. Some 20 million gallons were sprayed on Southeast Asian jungles, fields, and other targets over a 9-year period from 1962 to 1971.
As years would go on, Forsad never took a salary from High Times. He was a rich man. His drug activities were going even better than his publishing business. All High Times profits went to fund other projects. There's even a story that tells of Forsad giving the founder of Normal $10,000 to keep the company from going under. In Forsad's later years, he was suffering from seasonal affective disorder and would have extreme emotional swings. He would ultimately pass away in 1978 to a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In his will, the High Times founder had left stock to Normal, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Another cause stipulated that in the year 2000, employees who had been on staff for at least 10 years would inherit it. This never happened. High Times would rescue itself from the brink of bankruptcy several times, and as we all know, is still around today. One of the best events and ideas that High Times magazine would have would be the creation of the Cannabis Cup series. Starting in the 1980s in Amsterdam, a collection of cannabis breeders would come together in one location and celebrate cannabis at an all-time level. Having different kinds of strains by different breeders and growers, this was the mecca of cannabis culture. Following the laxing of cannabis laws in America, High Times magazine now hosts the Cannabis Cup stateside. Some big names have come out of High Times magazine. Ed Rosenthal was one of the original authors for the magazine, something I didn't actually know. Fellows like Danny Danko have also come from the magazine. It's obvious that High Times magazine has had an instrumental role on the legalization and spreading awareness of cannabis across the globe. As the company's changed hands from family owners to independents, that focus and that mission has kind of diluted slightly. There was a time when High Times magazine was a counterculture publication that stood for the people and the cause. The same can't be said for today. It seems that the company puts profits and celebrities first and has lost focus on the true cause of its existence. Hemorrhaging employees, suing its staff, inflating its worth to investors, and diving deeper into the dispensary scene. In 2020, the company would get its first dispensary. There's a reason a former editor said that the Rolling Stones doesn't have a record label. You're competing with your advertisers, and you're no longer actually a media brand. You're a cannabis brand. And this is quite obvious for High Times today. But this is the rise of High Times magazine. If you'd like to discuss the legal battles, the employee complaints, the ownership woes, and everything else High Times magazine, let me know in the comments section below, and I'd love to dive into that discussion. There is a lot of information in regards to High Times magazine and its history in the country and the world that we didn't dive into in this video. There is a lot to know in regards to Thomas Forsad and High Times magazine as a whole. If you guys are interested in that, let me know. I'd love to dive into it. However, that is all the time I have today. I appreciate you guys for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you guys know what to do with that. If you enjoy these videos, hit that like button. And until next time, have yourselves an incredible day.